well beyond my expectations. Possibly a little something to do with the food, hopefully a little more something to do with this guy over here on my right. By the way, this is the Port Macquarie Research Seminar. We've been having these about once every 2 months. We would like to have a little bit more often. So if somebody has a research topic they'd like to speak on, please get in touch with any of us, really, and we'll be happy to work something out. It's my great pleasure to introduce Glenn. You'll hear a lot more about his personal accomplishments and putting out this tremendous book and what a great effort that was. I haven't known Glenn a long time, but what I'd like to comment on is the fact that Glenn has not just put his efforts into his personal work, but he's spent a lot of time in helping us develop a research culture here. Glenn put together and runs a psychology report, reading and discussion group, and is also very active in promoting students and getting the rest of us to do some real work. And that's something, as you can see, it's a new and young campus, and we're still growing quite a bit, and it's something we really want to see flourish. And with people like Glenn, I think we're going to do very well. And without any further ado, I'm going to let him speak about his talk on psychology and philosophy. Take it away.
Thank you, Kate. Wow, this is a lot bigger than we really thought. So we should start with some formalities. I'd like to acknowledge that the presentation tonight is occurring on the lands of the Biripi people, land that was never ceded, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to talk about the book tonight. It's a bit of a ridiculous activity to try and squeeze a 60,000 word book into a 45-minute talk. I'm going to really try hard to not talk longer than that for you, because it is, after all, mostly a party. But before we start, this is the book. You can see the cover there as well. So it is real, it doesn't exist, it has arrived. I would suggest that individuals perhaps not purchase, the hardcover themselves, because it is $144.
Other people speak French, I'm
sorry. Of course, the publisher's business model with these kinds of research books is to sell ebooks to libraries rather than sell them to individuals. But if you would like to read it, do just get in touch. I have an e-copy that I can share around a little bit. There are limits. But hopefully tonight you'll get a bit of a sense of what it's about. The weirdest thing about this coming out for me is that every time I tell people it's coming out, they ask how long has it taken to write it, and it probably took me about 6 months of actual work putting it together. But having said that, there's actual words in the book that were written in the first year of my PhD, so that was 2006. So depending on how you count it, it's about 13 years of work that's come into this. And I am hoping that it will be, I did say when I started writing it that it would be the last thing I do on consciousness. So it turns out it will be the third last thing I do on consciousness. Aside from some projects with honours students, and for those of you at this table, there are some projects that will be suggested for you about halfway through. Alright, so on to the content. I have notes, some of you will be used to this, some of you will find it weird. I won't actually read them, but I will get lost if I don't hold them. So the book, what's the book about? It's about consciousness in the sense of experience. So what I'm trying to do is develop a general theory of what it is to be conscious, but I'm doing this in a slightly different way. Most people who approach this problem rely heavily on data from the vision sciences. What I will do is rely on data from self-consciousness studies, in particular the experience of the body as me. So I'll talk more about what that experience is and how it's altered in experiments and pathology. But one of the things that I am really happy about with this project, and I think is good news for the science of consciousness, is that at least in broad brushstrokes, the general kind of theory that I've ended up with is very similar to the kind of theory that you get when you do consciousness studies through vision science. So I think that's good news in terms of converging evidence. For those of you who haven't seen me talk a lot, there's going to be a lot of slides like this. I really dislike PowerPoint slides, and so apologies to anyone who's not a native speaker of English, but I will have notes that I can give you afterwards to aid comprehension if that's your thing. But I've had to do a few slides tonight because we've got a few extended quotes and a few figures that we'll need to look at together. Alright, so the approach I'm going to take to consciousness is what I call a naturalistic approach. Sometimes I like to stick the word rigorously in front of that, because when you talk about naturalism in a room full of philosophers, sometimes it's a token gesture towards continuity with the sciences. What I'm talking about is theory driven by facts. Facts understood as states of the world. For the epistemologists here, of course, the issue there is that we only have access to facts via our representations of them. So, but we can treat facts as either states of the world or our representations of those. But what I'm really trying to get at there is just that this is meant to be an evidence-driven approach. The naturalism has a second strand to it, which some people may find uncomfortable, but I'm going to treat as a starting point, in that I'm going to assume that consciousness is a natural phenomenon. And I'm not going to spend any time tonight, I spend a little time in the book, but I'm not going to spend any time tonight arguing that consciousness is a part of the natural world. I'm just going to assume that it's a part of the natural world in the same way that planets, photons, societies, law courts, those sorts of things are all part of the natural world. So as to say, it's not a supernatural phenomena. We're not going to invoke any res cognitans. I don't know, some people speak French, I can't. I'm not going to assume any sort of mind stuff or any sort of magical extra qualities. All right, so we should start with a bit of a statement of the problem. So the problem, as I'll call it, the real problem of consciousness, or just the problem of consciousness, is how do we explain experience? There's a few, I mean, obviously the philosophers here will know that there's a long tradition of sort of worrying about whether or not that's possible. There are interesting issues around those worries that will matter for the theory that I'll get to later on. Is how do we know when someone is having an experience as opposed to just telling a story to try and make sense of something and then getting it really wrong. So I'll call that confabulation. But that sort of aspect of traditional problems of consciousness is going to come into and start guiding our theory. So I'm not completely ignoring that side of the literature when I'm saying that I'm taking a naturalistic approach. All right. So most of the data that I've used in developing this comes from the study of one particular kind of experience, which I call the feeling of embodiment. Bit of a funny term. It's not quite as easy to get hold of as like an experience of shape or colour or something like that. But what I'm talking about here is an aspect of our self-consciousness, which is particularly the experience of the body as me. So feeling that I am a distinct thing in the world. So you think of this as sort of like the phenomenological underpinnings of your ability to tell yourself apart from everything else. So how can you tell that you're not the table and the chair and the person next to you? It's because you have this feeling of embodiment of being, this thing here. Get a bit more of a sense of what this feeling is by looking at its manipulations, both in pathology and experimentally. So, feeling of embodiment is disrupted in a delusion called somatoparaphrenia. There will be a spelling test on that at the end. So this is one of a series of delusions which is common after parietal lesion, usually stroke, most commonly to the right parietal lobe, but not exclusively, and there's some debate about how common it is with left parietal lesion. But we're interested in patient experiences here, the phenomenology of it. So when someone experiences this damage, one of the kinds of delusions that they can get is the delusional belief that a part of their body isn't theirs, but is instead someone else's. And that's what somatoparaphrenia is. So this is quite a distressing experience, as you would expect, and there are reports of patients waking up, finding a limb, arm or a leg in their bed that they think isn't theirs, and then trying to get rid of it, throwing it out. People telling stories about things like wondering why someone put the cold, dead leg from a cadaver in their bed. So it's a really quite distressing thing to go through. But the basis for it does seem to be a loss in this feeling of embodiment. So I have here a bit of a discussion. It's not a speed reading test, I'll read it out to you. This is between a patient, Shirley, who has experienced this kind of stroke, and Todd Feinberg, who's one of the leading clinical researchers in this area. So Shirley's trying to describe what's going on. So her left arm is paralysed, and she believes that it's not hers. So she says, it took a vacation, referring to her left arm, without telling me it was going. It didn't ask, it just went. Feinberg says, what did? My pet rock. She lists her lifeless left arm to indicate that's what she's talking about. You call that your pet rock? Yeah. Why do you call it your pet rock? Because it doesn't do anything, it just sits there. That'll be important, we'll come back to it. When did you come up with that name? Right after it went flop. I thought I'd give it a nice name even though it was something terrible. Do you have any other names for it? Her. She belongs to me, so she's a her, she's mine, but I don't like her very well. She let me down. In what way? And then she goes on to talk about the experience of paralysis. Now, here, Shirley doesn't seem to have a problem just in attributing the arm to herself as a property or as something that we might own, like your rings or a pen or something like that. She's saying that it's hers, she's claiming ownership of it, but she's still not feeling like it's a part of her, a part of herself. And this seems to be the characteristic sort of experience of this delusion. All right, so that's going to be one of the things that we're going to try to understand tonight. How is it that people have that experience of a body part not being theirs, but instead being someone else's? The other thing that we'll try to understand is an illusion called the rubber hand illusion. So this attempts to recreate not this feeling of disownership of a body part, but rather shift this sort of feeling of embodiment from the body to an artificial body part. So how this was originally done, there are lots of variations on this that we can talk about in question time if anyone's interested. But basically, you sit at a table, you put your hand on the table, and then a screen's put up between you and it, so you can't see it. Put a prosthetic hand in front of you, one of the nice, posh, expensive ones, and then the experimenter just strokes your hand and the prosthetic hand at the same time. You look at the stroking on the prosthetic or the rubber hand, and then after a while, it comes to feel like the sense of touch is coming from the prosthesis, and people start to feel like the rubber hand that they're looking at has replaced their own real hand, that what they're looking at is now their real hand. Alright, so these are going to be, in broad brush strokes, with almost none of the actual data that's really interesting about these things, the two kinds of phenomena that we're going to try and get a grip on. Delusion of somatoparaphrenia, delusional belief that my body part isn't mine, it's someone else's, and the rubber hand illusion, feeling like I'm embodied in an artificial body part. Okay, so the theory is going to come in two parts. And the first part, I'm going to give you a statement of it, which is going to sound a little bit vacuous to start with. But once we start getting some meat on the bones, hopefully you'll see that there's actually an interesting idea here. So I'm going to propose that there are two kinds of body representations. See the book for the argument as to why it's these two. I'm going to call these online body representations, and these are about the body as it is right now. So experiencing my arm there for the purposes of this demonstration, and then an offline prototype. And the offline prototype is to be understood as, prototypes in concept theory are generally understood as a kind of average. Now, broadest strokes, the theory is, and this is where I say it sounds quite superficial, is you have a feeling of embodiment for body parts that you represent online when the online representation matches the body as represented in the offline prototype. Alright, so you've got two body representations. When they represent the same body, that's when you're feeling this feeling of embodiment. Sounds a bit vague and hand-wavy. So what I'm going to do is talk for a little while about the way that these representations work, so the medium of representation. So what's doing the work here is understanding these two different kinds of body representation, or body knowledge if you prefer that, in terms of a tool called conceptual or quality spaces. These are tricky notions to work with, so I'm going to try and give you a bit of a sense of what they are with reference to a rather more familiar conceptual quality space, and that's colour space. So I've got a nice lo-fi image of that because it's hard to get ones on Google. A nice lo-fi image of that for you in a little bit. So conceptual spaces or quality spaces are abstract spaces, but they are literal spaces in that they are defined by dimensions. But each dimension is not just a distance. Each dimension corresponds to a way in which a set of objects can be distinguished from each other. So when we come and look at this lovely lo-fi image of Knutsel colour space, we have a set of dimensions. This is a three-dimensional space. We have two Euclidean dimensions, one corresponding to saturation, so how grey or coloured a colour chip is, with the greyer, whiter, blacker ones at the centre and the more vivid colours out to the sides. And then we have another Euclidean dimension, so a straight line dimension, going from darkest colours at the bottom to lightest colours at the top. And then we have another kind of dimension which is a bit more unusual, which is called a radial dimension. So it's basically a circle, but distance is measured in it in a slightly different way than it is in the straight line dimensions. We don't need to worry about that too much for tonight. But around this circle is where you get the different hues. So you start at red and then go orange, yellow, yellowy greens, greens, greeny blues, blues, etc. right around until we get back to red. With this kind of work, which has been quite well established in colour science, so this particular space is Munsell space, so these are paint chips, relatively low saturation ones. You get this sort of map by getting subjects to put them on a surface, something like these tables, a little bit greyer than these tables are, and then have people tell them apart, and then you can order their judgments. We'll talk a bit more about that approach, but you can order their judgments and you can end up with basically this sort of space. Now, interesting features that this sort of kind of representation has. One is that similarity between the colours corresponds to distance in the space. So reds and oranges are relatively similar, so they're closer together than reds and greens or reds and blues are. Now, for this to do much work, you actually have to have a quite precise metrical measurement of that. We'll gloss over that a bit, but just for now, interesting thing is that you represent similarity with distance. Okay. Now, second interesting property is that you get general concepts represented in this kind of approach by regions in the space. So there are, as we can see here, there's a bunch of different oranges and yellows, each corresponding to a particular point in there, like one of the particular squares. But there's a set of those which are the oranges, and next to them a set of those which are the yellows, and the other side a set of them which are the reds. So these are regions in the space which correspond to our concepts. All right, so what I'm going to suggest is, for those kinds of body representation that we were talking about, that these be understood using a similar set of tools. That there's going to be a space where quality dimensions, or the dimensions, correspond not to hue, saturation and brightness, but to the ways in which that we can distinguish bodies, the way that we can tell them apart. There's been quite a lot of work on faces. Turns out with faces there are two major dimensions that are really important, and they're to do with the spacing of the nose and the mouth and of the eyes, and yeah, that's it. So again, how that works for the faces is that each point within the space corresponds to a particular face. The more similar the faces are, the closer they are together. All right, so if we're going to understand online and offline body representations in this way, online body representations are going to be particular points in space. You'll have these for any body that you can perceive, anyone that you can see, yourself. Obviously, each will have a corresponding point. The more similar people's body shapes and probably more to do with body postures is a really important dimension here. So it's probably all of you are more similar to each other at the moment because you're all sitting down, but because I'm standing up, I'm representing myself as a quite distant point from that. And then the second kind of body representation that we want to understand is the offline ones. So these correspond to prototype points. So whereas if we come back to colour space, you would have a typical red, which is sort of at the centre of the red space. Or you can see it better on the blues because of the way they've sliced it, but there's a sort of typical blue in there somewhere. That's your prototype of what a blue experience is, at least out of these sets of colour chips. All right, so understanding that then gives us a way to understanding what matching between the two different kinds of body representations is in a non-trivial way. And that is for an online body representation to fall within the concept-bounded region around the offline prototype. Right, getting pretty abstract. So I'm going to try and bring it a bit more back to a concrete example with an experiment that we've done measuring this. So if this kind of account is right, and that, if we're going to say to be an experience of blue is just to fall within the blue region of that space, to be a feeling of embodiment is just to fall in the right part of body space. This makes a set of testable predictions. It makes quite a long list of predictions, but we have tested 2 of those. The simplest one is just that it should be possible to discover a conceptual quality space for bodies. Now, our approach was to look at hands because we were manipulating the feeling of embodiment using the rubber hand illusion, the standard touching one that I was describing earlier. So we thought we should be able to discover a conceptual quality space for hands. Most obvious prediction to make is that during the rubber hand illusion, the point in the space that represents the rubber hand should move closer to a point in space that is the subject's offline prototype. That's really hard to test because it's very hard to get good measures of individual conceptual spaces. So the colour space that I had up before is an average across a large number of subjects. We were able to get an average hand space across actually quite a small number of subjects, just 14. So we were really glad that it did work, but it was a really hard experiment to do. All right. So that sort of more obvious prediction there is quite hard to test. But the easier one to test is that if this kind of approach is right, then the rubber hand should be treated as more hand-like, more like a real hand following the illusion than prior to it. This is much easier to test because you do have a point in a group average conceptual space which corresponds to a group average hand, which is just the centre of the space. So the easier prediction to test is that for the group, following induction of the illusion, the point representing the rubber hand should move closer to the centre of the space. All right, so we were able to test this. First, we gave subjects a series of 3 images of hands, and the subject's task is just to pick the odd one out. So pick the hand that's the most different. From this, you develop something called a dissimilarity score. You do it over a large number of trials. You get an average dissimilarity score, and then you get your stats magician Zhao Xing Gao to do his wondrous work in MATLAB and map out the distance between each of the hands corresponding to this dissimilarity score. I'm not going to bore you much with the stats, but the approach is pick the odd one out, put it in MATLAB, and you end up with a picture that looks a bit like this. So these are the series of hands. You're not going to be able to see this fantastically, but there's a series of hands here, all of the participants. But the important thing is that way up here, quite a long way from the other hands, and quite a long way from the centre of the space, which is in here somewhere, is the rubber hand. So this is the map that, the kind of similarity map, if you like, that we got during a control condition with the rubber hand. Now, when we did the experimental condition and induced the illusion, and yes, we did ask subjects to report whether or not they were experiencing the illusion, and yes, they did, you get a bit of a change such that the rubber hand has now moved closer. Trust me that it's quite a statistically significant jump But the easiest way to visualize that, if you just look at this set of yellow hands, it's in quite a different position relative to those between them. So it's way up away from them, and then it's moved down towards them. So this does confirm that prediction that it would be more hand-like, because we have seen a statistically significant. So the other interesting thing then we want to know is, what are the quality dimensions here? How are people telling the hands apart? For all of the solutions we did, the most important one, so the one that people used the most, was a dimension that seemed to rely on both the gender and hairiness on the hands. So at one end, you've got hands that people say, that's a manly hand and it's very hairy. And at the other end, you've got a hand that people say, that's a girly hand and it's not very hairy. The other two dimensions tend to correspond to the way the hand is held. So you get things like the spacing between the fingers. It was important in one condition. The other one was just the distance between the thumb and the rest of the hand. In one of the solutions, the actual thickness of the fingers seemed to be more important than the spacing between them. This seemed to depend on whether or not we were actually including the rubber hand in the sample set. So it's just what's more important for telling these hands apart as opposed to telling these hands apart from the rubber hand. Bit of a triviality for our purposes tonight, but the important thing there was that yes, it is possible to find, we really do seem to be doing this, we really seem to represent hands in this way, and that it does change the way we represent them. Now, it turns out from previous work with the rubber hand illusion that probably by far the most important cue for getting a match is that the perceived body moves as you predict that it will. So it will move as you expect it. But in cases of somatoparaphrenia, the patient is paralyzed. The damage to the parietal lobe is not just causing these strange experiences, it's causing them to be unable to move. So this important cue of being able to move as predicted is missing. Now, because of that, it can become hard to generate this match without relying on other cues. So there are other cues that we can use, like you can look at it and go, yes, my arm is still attached to me and so on. That's evidence that you can use to generate a match. But what seems to be going on in the case of somatoparaphrenia is that for these patients, those sorts of cues are initially undervalued compared to this cue of moving as predicted. All right, why do we think that? Well, we think that because when somatoparaphrenia remits, as it typically does after a couple of weeks, patients seem to overvalue. All right. So what's the sort of overvaluing that we see, and what's the evidence for that? Well, this is much more speculative. And of course, there isn't great evidence on these kinds of delusions. They're tremendously interesting from the point of view of consciousness studies because they're such radically different experiences. But of course, the priority is, when someone is in these conditions, to keep them alive. So when we get evidence from it, it's only from a small number of people who are willing to volunteer their time when they're well enough to do so. So we have only one case study to really drive this main hypothesis, but I think it is an interesting and suggestive one, and does fit well with some other literature that, again, you can read about. So this was one study by a group led by Van Straven with a patient known as GE. Now, patient GE followed the typical sort of pattern of had the stroke, developed hematopancreatemia, and then a few weeks later it remitted. But the doctors noticed that this particular patient was touching her arm quite a lot after the delusion had remitted. So after she was starting to feel like, yes, this is my arm, that she was touching it quite a lot. And I asked her about it. She said, oh, I'm doing it because it helps me feel connected to it. And I thought, well, if that's really important to her, that active self-touch is really important to her for producing this feeling of embodiment now, well, maybe it should be easier to induce the rubber hand illusion for her using this approach. So this is what they tried to do, is they said, all right, so instead of touching that arm, now touch the rubber hand, touch the prosthetic. And what they found was that she more readily experienced a feeling of embodiment over the prosthetic than other people did very quickly on herself. Normally, just touching it yourself doesn't work, but she was able to then experience the feeling of embodiment in the rubber hand. And then at the same time, she seemed to become more unsure about her real arm. She started to feel less embodied in that. Also, some interesting control conditions around actually feeling embodied in conditions with the rubber hand that don't normally work for other people. But you put this all together and you get generally the view that this active self-touch has just become so much more important for her in generating this feeling of embodiment. And seems to be an overvaluing of that cue in that manner. So we think that what is going on is that some of the important cues that have been lost due to the paralysis can no longer generate the match, and that some of the other normal cues that we would use, like being able to look at it and see that it's connected, are undervalued in those patients. There are reasons to think why that will work. Typically, there are attentional problems and so on. We can talk about that in question time if you like. So, starting to get up to the time that I said that I'd stop, and I'm going to sort of partway through. I can do the second half more quickly because there's fewer ideas to introduce. But what we're seeing there is that it looks like we can explain the alterations of the feeling and the embodiment in both cases using these tools, using this understanding of what matching body representations in conceptual space is, and using this understanding of what evidence we use to produce a match. Okay. So if I'm going to say feeling of embodiment is just an online body representation matching an offline prototype, or more strictly an online body representation falling in the right region of conceptual or quality space, this kind of theory of consciousness is known as a vehicle theory of consciousness. It's one that says what consciousness is, what experience is a particular way of representing the world. In this case, it's representing the world using conceptual equality spaces. Unconscious representations and unconscious processes make use of different kinds of representations. They're different things. But these ones, these special ones, these are what consciousness is. Now, a problem for this kind of general approach is understanding a phenomenon called confabulation. So this is what I mentioned right at the start about trying to be able to tell when someone's having an experience and when they're just saying something that's telling a story to try and make sense of something weird, but they're getting it wrong. Now, easiest way to get a grip on what confabulations are in this context is to look at what might be considered a provoked confabulation. So provoked confabulations are stories that people tell to try and make sense of the gap in their knowledge. They're not trying to deceive anyone. They're doing their best to fill in the gaps, but there's a gap there. And this is the sort of thing that we see quite a lot with delusions like somatic paraphrenia. So here was another clinical interview, whose arm is this? It's not mine. Whose is it? It's my mother's, so this is a specific attribution, quite common. How on earth does it happen to be here? I don't know. I found it in my bed. How long has it been there? And this statement is the interesting bit here. Since the first day, feel it, it's warmer than mine. The other day when the weather was colder, it was warmer than mine. So here, patient is having a really weird experience. They're experiencing their arm as though it's their mother's, and indeed they believe that to be the case. But they're being challenged by the examiner on this, because the examiner, of course, knows that's weird, and they can see that it's attached to their body. And then they seem to be telling the story to try and justify their claim. So this is the sort of thing that looks like the provoked confabulation, making up this story about it feeling warmer than their arm normally does as a way of trying to justify and make sense of the weirdness and the stressful weirdness that they're being confronted with. Indeed, some people have proposed that all of somatic paraphrenia is like that. I think there's good evidence that it's not, but nonetheless, this is the sort of case that we're worried about. Now, a question is, if we offer a vehicle theory, so one that says to be conscious is to represent the world in a particular way, how do we make sense of the possibility of confabulation? What would a confabulation be on that account? And there I'm thinking not just of the words that come from the patient's mouth, but the mental state that is causing them to say those things. Because by definition, they're not having this experience. They're not consciously experiencing their arm as warmer, if that's a confabulation. But this also isn't a typical unconscious state, because it's something that's being reported. So is this being represented in the right way or not? Well, perhaps one way we can try and make sense of this is to understand this in terms of causal relationships between mental states and reports. You say, well, if they're actually experiencing it, it's being represented in the right way, in the right conceptual quality space, and that's causing the report. If they're not experiencing it, then it's some other sort of mental representation that's causing that report. But the issue that we get here is that this is then no longer a vehicle theory, because we're bringing in this extra set of tools, the relational property of causation between mental representation of vehicles and reports. To be a pure vehicle theory, you can only refer to the intrinsic properties of the vehicle. That's the defining feature of the approach. So then we're no longer talking about the special way of representing the world. We're talking about what that way of representing the world causes and what other ways of representing the world. So perhaps we should take a different approach. So another approach, one of the mainstream approaches within natural philosophy of mind, and certainly a dominant approach within neuroscience, a bit hard to say whether it is within psychology, is to take a functionalist approach and say, all right, maybe what's going on with consciousness is not a difference between, the difference between conscious and unconscious is not a difference between two different ways of representing the world, but it's a matter of doing different things, computing different things, performing different functions with those ways of representing the world. Now, this sort of approach, and I'll skip over a lot of the detail here, but this sort of approach is helpful because it gives us a way to make sense of confabulation. Because if we're going to make sense of confabulation, let's consider again this experience of the arm being warmer than it should be. If that's, we would ask, does the patient experience the lack of feeling of embodiment in the arm and then come up with the story, saying that it's now warmer, or does everything that gets to consciousness, does that, when that experience of the arm comes up, does it already have that experience of being warmer with it? Talk about this as elaborated content, and this is the content that we're talking about when we're trying to understand if something is confabulated. Now, the cool thing about functions is it says there's no difference between those two accounts, because consciousness is just processing that representation of this lost feeling of embodiment. So just processing that representation of the arm, that's what it is to be conscious of it. Specifically, things like making it available to report, making it available to memory, making it guide other actions, so making it go, well, that's weird, etc., etc. You see then that putting in that content, it's feeling warm, is a way of using that representation. So it's an additional process. A functionalist is going to say, well, that's using it, so that is consciousness of it. So we just have this question then of not, is it feeling warmer before or after it enters consciousness? It's just, does that feeling of warmness get added early in the process that is consciousness, or does it get added late in the process that is consciousness? The important thing here is that unlike the sort of vehicle theory that we were looking at before, there is a story for the functionalist to tell about what confabulation is. There's a way for them to make sense of it. Whether or not you buy there's no real difference between those two options. The point is that the functionalist can make sense of it, but the vehicle theorist can't, at least not easily. So maybe we should then just go for a straight functionalist theory and say, all of this stuff that we're talking about for most of the talk tonight, that's just been about how we represent the art. That's not about how we experience it at all. But then we face a different problem. Because if we do that and we say experience is just use of mental states, or just use of these representations, then it becomes very hard to tell why different experiences feel very different. So if we think back to the rubber hand illusion, this is just an illusion. People undergo this illusion, they look at the hand and go, yeah, that feels like I'm now looking at my hand, but hey, I know that I'm not. So if my hand really did jump from there to there, that would have hurt. I would have noticed that. So we have two different judgments about knowing that I'm not. So if my hand really did jump from there to there, that would have hurt. I would have noticed that. So we have two different judgments about the illusion being made simultaneously. One, yeah, it feels like it's mine. Two, I know that it's not. Now, for the functionalist, they would say, well, both of these representations, I know that it's not yet, I feel like it is, they're being processed a lot. They're coming up to verbal report and memory, and they're guiding my action. I can say all sorts of things about it. I'm going to develop all sorts of thoughts about it. And that's what it is to be conscious of it. I'm just conscious of those two different things. But the question is, why do those two things feel so different? Feeling of embodiment, the illusional feeling, feels like a feeling. It feels bodily, it's tactile. But the judgment that it's not feels like a judgment. It feels like talking to yourself, saying to yourself, remembering things. So why would they feel different if they're conscious in the same way, and that is just in virtue of being processed? So our solution here is to just say, let's put the two approaches together. Let's put the vehicle theory and the functional theory together and say, these can both explain consciousness. but they explain different aspects of consciousness. The vehicle approach explains the phenomenal qualities, the why does it feel this way rather than that way. The functionalist approach explains how does it get to the forefront of my mind, how is it in my awareness, so to speak. So that'll do us. I only went 10 minutes long, I think, but that gives you, I think, in very broad brushstrokes, what the theory in the book is about. So we've got plenty of time for questions, but do grab yourself another drink before we get into those. Thanks.